Some legends are told, some turn to dust or to gold, but you will remember me for centuries.
This is The Cameron Parker Show, brought to you by Spreaker, where we discuss everything from around the local professional sports scene in Colorado, such as the Denver Broncos.
Chris Harris comes out. I don't know if he was on the drive, but he said, I knew 15 seconds into that game that I should have been on T.Y. Hilton. If players are coming out and saying that, it falls again on the coaching staff. Not to mention insiders from around your local sports scene. Ryan Spilborgs, former outfielder for your Colorado Rockies.
It's not going to be the 25 guys that leave spring training that are going to be the only guys the entire season. I mean, you need depth. You need guys that are going to be in your minor leagues that you may not expect.
Ryan Edwards.
You know, when you're talking about an offensive line, it's about the five best guys, right? And you're talking about the five best guys gelling. There hasn't been a lot of time for that.
It's showtime. Are you ready? Welcome in, ladies and gentlemen. It is another installment of the Cameron Parker Show. Another installment with CJ Krainock, and CJ is joining us right on the top of the show, and we will be talking with the FantasyGurus.com analyst. Before we kick it off to CJ, how's the website going, my man? Oh, looks like CJ's out and about. I think he's actually went to go to the bathroom. Because what do? You got to go to the bathroom.
Cameron, I'm there. Cameron,
You're here. You're here.
I was talking to you the whole time.
Definitely didn't hear you, my man. But hey, that's all right.
Thank you for trying to go to the bathroom on air.
Hey, you know what? There's a first for everything. There is a first for everything. FantasyGurus.com analyst CJ Krainock joins us. How is that website?
Dude, it's going great. Today was our official launch day, the first day that we started advertising and started driving some traffic to our site. And I think that it's been fantastic. Some people have reached out to me, left some comments, and it's been really great. And for starting up in the middle of the year, I think that I'm so happy with the way everybody is. The feedback that I've been getting and some of those things, and I've just been really happy, really satisfied, and hopefully there's big things to come for both of us.
Absolutely. And speaking of Fantasy Gurus, have you thought about maybe even making it into a Twitter handle, or should I say, well, maybe just go straight forward? How can they get a hold of you on Twitter?
Right now, the best way to get a hold of me on Twitter is at CalCrainock21. And I'll be providing a link on the website here in the next couple days to my personal Twitter account until I get the business account up and running. But I think right now you're best off following me. I give fantasy advice. That's mostly what I talk about on my Twitter. I don't bombard you with a bunch of personal information. So that's the best way, the best person to follow right now. I provide links to our website and advice that you can ask questions. I had a couple people ask questions throughout the week, and I always stop and give them some advice, and I think that it's helped them. So that's the best way to do that. And follow the show, too. Follow the show on Twitter.
Absolutely. Be sure to follow the Cameron Parker Show handle at CP_show, and as well as my Twitter handle as well at Cameron Parker PO. And if you guys are wondering what the PO stands for, it's predominantly orange. That is the site which I predominantly write for. No pun intended, or pun intended, I should say. We have a lot to talk about, obviously, with the fantasy sports, but we're going to do something a little bit differently. Obviously, we always will talk about fantasy football, but this week has been the kickoff to the general manager meetings, or the GM meetings, for Major League Baseball. And obviously, you and I, got to go by grammar, right? You and I are big baseball aficionados, and so we'll talk a little bit about the baseball offseason and what it means for the Colorado Rockies. And so we'll be talking about that after the fantasy football segment. But so let's kick it off. Let's kick into it. As far as the fantasy football is concerned, who are your? Well, actually, maybe let's change it up a little bit. We would usually do our starts and sits, but go through your positional rankings. If you were to do your positional rankings so far this week.
Okay, yeah, so I'll talk about, I have them up on the website, fantasygurus.org/rankings, and you can find them there. But I can talk about some surprises that I have on here as far as my rankings go. So first, let's talk about some of these teams that are on bye weeks, which are Carolina, Indianapolis, New York, the Jets, and San Francisco. So every single week I post on the website what teams have byes so that you know what you're looking for and with your own lineup, and so that you're not confused by my rankings. So this week, obviously, we're missing Cam Newton, which is a huge one, especially after the week that he just had. Cam Newton's not going to be in there, and neither is Christian McCaffrey because they're on bye. You're not really looking at a whole lot of Colts. Jacoby Brissett, maybe, if you needed a filler. But Robbie Anderson is going to be gone too, and he was a top 20 play for me last week. So I think that we need to look at some fillers for these bye weeks, and I'll talk about some of these right now. So first, for quarterbacks, if you're looking to fill Cam Newton's spot this week, for whatever reason, dude, I can't. We talk about this every week, and I don't know why he's still available. But Jared Goff, if he is available in your league, then one, you're probably in a terrible league, and two, you need to scoop him up right now. He shouldn't be available. Neither should Cooper Kupp. We talk about this every week.
Right. And it's so funny. You should probably add a number 3, and that would be how horrible of a general manager you are in running your own team that you haven't drafted Jared Goff yet. You should probably add that as number 3.
Yeah, the only reason you shouldn't have Jared Goff on your team, if he's available right now in your league, is if you have Tom Brady or Carson Wentz. That's it. Those are the only two guys for me that would mean that you really don't need a second quarterback. And even then, you could still use Jared Goff. So I don't know. That'd be the only excuse I can think of. But Jared Goff is quarterback 10 for me this week. It doesn't even matter who they play. Just plug him in, please. Please, just pick him up. I'm tired of looking at these free agent rankings and seeing his percent ownership. It's stupid. It's his top 10 quarterback. Pick him up, please.
Well, and like we've been mentioning, he's an underrated MVP candidate as well. What are some other positional rankings that you have up there?
All right, so I rank every single position every week. So quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, kicker, and defense.
Do you go defensive players?
Started doing the kickers. Sorry, what was that?
Sorry, do you go defensive players also, or just defense?
No, not defensive players. I hope to get into that maybe by next season. I play in a couple leagues, some dynasty leagues that also do defensive players.
I love the defensive players.
Yeah, I love playing in leagues like that. They're so fun. It's so deep. You really have to.
Well, I was going to say, on a personal level, if you are interested in joining my league, to kind of extend an invite maybe for next year if someone doesn't want to be a part of my league, you are more than welcome to join. There's some annoying ex-roommate of yours that's in that league. But we do have defensive players in that one. And it's a pretty in-depth league as far as the amount of roster size. So if you were interested.
Yeah. I mean, reach out to either of us if you're looking to get on a team.
Absolutely.
And we'll get you on a good one. Yeah. We have, I know both of us playing some pretty good, pretty active leagues, and nobody likes deadbeat owners, and I know at the end of the year we just kind of flush everybody out that didn't participate, put in new guys that are great. So reach out to either of us. Yeah,
sorry to go on a little bit of a bunny trail, but go ahead. Talk about your other positional rankings for a sec. You're talking about the defense and your running backs, tight ends, and so on and so forth. Go ahead and talk about that some more.
Okay, yeah, so this is the first week that I've started ranking kickers because that was something that was requested to me.
Well, kickers are people too.
Yeah, kickers are people too. I just don't like ranking them because I feel like it's such an up-in-the-air thing. Like, it's hard to predict who's going to have good games at the kicker position, because that means that their offense isn't getting in the end zone. You can only predict that so far, but I did my best, and I have those up there now. I rank them up to kicker 20. If you're looking past kicker 20, you don't need my advice. Just pick someone up. So let's talk about some running back fill-ins real quick. Do you have Christian McCaffrey on your team, or one of these other teams that are on bye? And I think that Isaiah Crowell finally had the game that we've all been waiting for this week, and he's available in a good percent of leagues because he was dropped so heavily at the beginning, but he finally found the end zone, had close to 100 yards, and they finally played well. And I think Isaiah Crowell is a good back that is maybe worth adding for a fill-in. I have him as running back 11 this week. Jay Ajayi, he's probably not available in your league because of the hype, but I think that he starts to take over that share of touches in the backfield for Philadelphia. Anybody in the Philadelphia offense is a good play for me every week. And then a good ad for this week, Samaje Perine. If I'm even saying that right, pretty sure it's Samaje Perine. But he's going to be taking over the snaps for Washington. And they've got a good matchup this week. I have him as running back 19, probably available in your league. Tevin Coleman, because Devontae Freeman just went down with an injury. He's going to have all the snaps this week. I'm grabbing both those guys, and they're plug-and-plays for me if you have a bye week.
All right. Well, what about now let's transition into the starts and sit-ems as far as the starts and sits for a fantasy lineup. And who are your starts and sits? And then we'll go into the most important category of the week, and that is the waiver wire.
I have Matt Ryan as a sit this week. I just don't think that you can look at Matt Ryan and all the production that he's had this year and justify his ownership in most leagues. And I think that he right now is just kind of the name. He's you're buying the name of Matt Ryan, and I think that there's better options out there for you. So I have Matt Ryan as a sit this week. I don't think that's too crazy of a call, but some other sites I've looked at don't say the same. So I have Matt Ryan as a sit this week. But I have a start this week of Case Keenum. And I think a lot of people are going to look at Case Keenum and say that it was a fluke last week. He threw 4 touchdowns. And you know what? You might be right. But with a good matchup on the horizon, I think that, the offense itself is not a fluke. And I think that Case Keenum racks up a good amount of yards, gets you a couple touchdowns this week. He's a good fill-in for me. So that's one start sit. And then I'll give you one more. And I think that I'm going to go with the wide receiver position here. And Tyreek Hill, this pains me to say because I went to school with Tyreek Hill. I just am not impressed by the volume, and it scares me. He's getting 1-2 receptions a week. Yeah, they're big, but it's one of these weeks they're not going to hit him deep. They're going to miss him on the 1 or 2, 3, 4 targets, whatever he's getting, that low number, and he's not going to get that big play, and you're going to throw up a big fat 0. And so I have Tyreek Hill, maybe not as a sit, but as a risky play this week, somebody that you might not, you might want to look somewhere else.
Maybe like a flex spot.
Yeah, maybe like a flex play. Actually, I have him as wide receiver 8. The more I think about it, I might move him down, but that's more because there's this chunk in the middle of the wide receiver rankings that's so weird this year. It's so strange. Let me find an example. I have Kelvin Benjamin as wide receiver 22. Who would have thought that at the beginning of the year? AJ Green is not a top 10 wide receiver for me this week. Who would have thought that? Juju Smith-Schuster is wide receiver 17. I mean, if you called that one at the beginning of the year, good for you. But, there's this weird group in the middle of these wide receivers, and they're just so hard to rank. And Tyreek Hill is getting towards that middle for me. And I'm a little scared of that. Go ahead, Cameron.
I was going to say, is that just because there's no parity anymore from the wide receiver position, aside from Antonio Brown and Odell Beckham Jr., just in general? Is that just because there's really no parity? But as far as the top 3 wide receivers?
Yeah, I think you're getting really similar. I feel like there's a lot of number 2 wide receivers this year that are playing wide receiver ones. And it's really like Robert Woods last week had over 100 yards and 2 touchdowns. And we weren't even talking about Robert Woods. And it's like weird stuff like that keeps happening. And then on top of that, I feel like quarterback this year has been such a big drop-off. When I'm looking at these quarterback rankings this week, when I was trying to rank them, I was saying, like, wow, once you hit quarterback 5, even with I have Alex Smith in my top 5 even. So even inside top 5, like, man, I'm not confident in a lot of these guys. I'm not confident in Derek Carr this year. I'm not really confident in Kirk Cousins this year. Dak Prescott doesn't have Zeke anymore. I'm not too confident in him either. Then Case Keenum's right after him. Like, who would have thought that we'd be playing Case Keenum at this point in the year? Jay Cutler. Like, it's really, you get down into the bulk after, like, quarterback 5, and it's weird. And so I think that's the problem with the wide receivers is because, we've had Andrew Luck hurt. We've had Aaron Rodgers hurt. And so people like Jordy Nelson are way down. And, and all of the Colts receivers are down. And it's just a weird year. And I think last week was the weirdest week of the weird year. And I think we all saw that. Just some funky things happened. So I think that I've gotten some good rankings off this. You guys can go check it out if you're as confused as I was when I started trying to make sense of this all.
Jacoby Brissett. Obviously, Jacoby Brissett has, by all intents and purposes, surprised a lot of people with his play. Where is he in your fantasy rankings?
So they're on bye this week, so he's not in there this week. But if I'm going to rank him for the rest of the year, I think that I probably have him somewhere near quarterback 15. So if you're in a 2-quarterback league, you can do worse than Jacoby Brissett for sure. Or the rest of these bye week fillers. I think Jacoby Brissett, they play from behind a lot. He throws a lot. I think he's actually shown some improvement. He's actually pretty good.
Yeah.
The Patriots gave away a good one, which I think they gave away 2 good ones this year.
Right.
And I think I'm probably about on quarterback 15.
Well, it's now time for, what do you want to call it, my public humiliation, or an opportunity for people to understand a potential trade that people can grade as far as people that are listening to the show. Me and CJ are in a fantasy league, and, well, let's just put it bluntly, I stink in this fantasy league. I am currently 2-7 or 2-8, and I went through with a trade that potentially was a rebuilding move, to say the least. And now certainly there were a lot of quarterbacks on the table. There were certainly a lot of quarterbacks that were of interest to me. But I ended up pulling a trigger on a trade that potentially, well, to put it bluntly, I was way too emotional in my Christian McCaffrey pick. And right now, especially based off of the week that he had on Monday, it sucks even more.
Yeah, that was a rough one.
Right, but overall, it was a rebuilding pick. I traded Christian McCaffrey and I believe it was Stephon Diggs, and a defense and a number 1 overall pick for Mitchell Trubisky. Just because, overall, I've outlined my quarterbacks numerous times here on the Cam Parker Show as far as our fantasy segment, and I was relying on Matt Moore. So, obviously I needed somebody, and Mitchell Trubisky's actually overall played pretty decent as far as the numbers and everything out there. So Mitchell Trubisky's been playing pretty decent, but as far as, is he the future? Is he the guy going forward? That's tough to tell. But however, I am rebuilding, so at the same time, I had to consider that move. But overall, CJ, how would you grade the move?
How would I rate the move? I think, well, this is a dynasty league. If you hadn't mentioned that, I don't know if you did. This is a dynasty league, so you'll take that, your players into the next season. and we keep all of our players. So it's one of those you have to wait and see trades. It depends. I've been hearing some rumblings on Twitter and some other people that I talk to that scout for the draft, and they're saying that, you know, they at the beginning of this year they were really touting this draft class as, you know, maybe they were saying maybe the best class that we'd ever had. And
you mean the one upcoming?
Yeah, the one upcoming, the upcoming year. So the draft pick that you traded for next year, and that was because of the amount of quarterbacks and how they thought they were going to progress, the amount of first-round quarterbacks that were expected to go, and there was some top-end talent at running back, which there still is with Saquon Barkley. But, you know, now that we're in the middle of the season, you're starting to see a lot of that shine fade to the point where people like Matt Miller are putting out articles saying that this might be the worst class of this decade. And, I mean, that's a really big shift from before. So when you're trading away draft picks like that, if you end up with the third or fourth pick and not number one, and you're not picking Saquon Barkley, I mean, you don't know what they're going to get with that. And so I think this is a wait-and-see kind of thing where you have to see what they got with that pick. I don't think he gave up too much with Stephon Diggs as far as fantasy goes. The Falcons' defense, I mean, that doesn't matter at all. But Christian McCaffrey hasn't proven that he's a three-down back in the NFL yet. And so we have to wait and see on him, too. If he's just a passing down back, then he'll always be in the top 20 running backs, but he may never be in the top 10. And if you got Mitchell Trubisky, who, if he improves, like Carson Wentz or Jared Goff did in their second year, that could have been a great trade for you with how important quarterbacks are in fantasy football, especially in that dynasty league. And, you know, so I think that's a wait-and-see thing. I know a lot of people were hating on it at first, and maybe rightfully so, I don't know. But I think that in dynasty leagues, you have to wait and see. You just don't know. I mean, there's some trades that I made where immediately, you know, I felt terrible the last few years, and then all of a sudden, like, so-and-so that I traded away tears their ACL, and I look like a genius, right? So you got to wait and see. You know, you can't judge, just like in the regular NFL, you can't judge off of, you know, the 10 games that we've seen or 9 games if they've had a bye week. And you can't judge a player off that like Christian McCaffrey or Mitchell Trubisky. So,
well, I was going to say, just in general, you can't really judge trades, you know, really off the top. I mean, baseball is really a prime example of that, just in general. But especially with the NFL, and you make a significant trade like that involves really the number one overall pick for the number one overall pick, you know? Really, at the end of the day, I think it is a judge, but it does not help matters. And this just goes for fantasy's sake. It does not help matters when you trade a guy or should I say the centerpiece of your trade, and that centerpiece of the trade that you traded puts up monster numbers, like nearly 15 to 20 points. So
next day, yeah.
Right, literally the next day. And not surprisingly, by the way, Brooks chimes in and says that, Cam, he says, you suck. He said, you gave up the number one pick. And he said, I graded an F-. Well, and we talked about it, that there was a lot of backlash over it. But at the same time, you know, like we're talking about, you really can't really judge it based off of just this season. I mean, there's no question as far as he might have a new head coach next season. He might have a new offensive coordinator next year because if the head coach is fired, if John Fox gets let go, well, then you're going to be looking at a new potential staff for Mitchell Trubisky. And especially when you're a young quarterback in general, that could potentially backfire on you, or it could potentially be a huge draw depending on who they get potentially to work with Mitchell Trubisky. So it's kind of a double-edged sword in a way. And so who knows potentially what the fantasy value for Mitchell Trubisky could end up being.
Yeah, I lot of people that listen to this podcast are in some kind of dynasty league or some deeper league, and I think that, look at what happened to Jared Goff. He looked like a bust last year. I mean, first overall pick bust, and people were calling for his head, telling him, to draft another quarterback this year. They didn't do it. They hired a new head coach. They thought that maybe that guy would bring in his guy, and he didn't. And look at Jared Goff now. He looks like a star. He's going to be a Pro Bowler if he keeps it up. And you just don't know. And when you're in a dynasty league, especially at the quarterback position, you just don't know from year to year. I mean, I had Cam Newton a couple years ago in a dynasty league, and I wish I would have traded him when he had that MVP season, because until last night, he hadn't been like that for 2 years. And, that's just something you don't know. And I'm sure when you're in the moment of that MVP season, you're thinking Cam Newton's on top of the world and you're going to have the best quarterback every year for the rest of your dynasty. And that's just not true. So there's so many things that you have to take into account. And people get and this is something I want to hit on, is people get so attached to draft picks.
You're talking to me here because of the fact that I was so attached to Christian McCaffrey.
Yeah, well, I mean, and even like trading future picks, and both. So there's I think there's two different things I'm trying to say here. One is, when you draft somebody, you have to remember they're expendable. And I think we all fall in love with players, and you can't do that. Think of how the Patriots run things. And if you've ever thought that you weren't expendable on the Patriots, then you were wrong. That's how they function. That's how they do things, unless your name's Tom Brady. And maybe even he's expendable later in the future when he's older, and if they're not winning. You never know.
Define older, he's like 4 years old.
Yeah, when he's like 80 and can't throw anymore. That's when he's going to retire.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. You have to think in that regard, because if you get too attached to somebody, like, let's say that I was super attached to Carson Wentz last year, and I was calling the breakout this year, and somebody gave me a really good offer, and I turned it down, and then he just wasn't it. That's something that you can't get attached to people, because especially in fantasy football, you don't even know these people. So
right.
Don't get too attached, and trading future draft picks, you don't know what that future draft pick is going to be. And like I was saying, like, if you would have traded that future draft pick 6 months ago and they're saying this was the draft of the century, you would have got a lot out of it. But now it's all of a sudden the bust of the last 15 years, and it's not worth as much. So don't get too attached to anything in fantasy football, and you got to be able to be liquid in your thoughts.
All right, well, let's go into it. We mentioned it that we want to talk about the waiver wires potential ads. Who are the potential ads of the week?
So I talked about a couple already. I'll mention their names again. Samaje Perine and Tevin Coleman are definitely names that you want to add this week, and they're starts if you have them on your roster. And so I'm looking at those guys. Jamal Williams, for me, is a good ad this week. And this might be, we're talking about getting too attached to players. I know Jamal Williams, so I will admit that I am biased, but I know this kid's a baller, and if he gets an opportunity in Green Bay, if Ty Montgomery's out, he might just run with it. So think about Jamal Williams if you're hurting for running backs. As far as wide receivers go, Juju Smith-Schuster is still available in your league. You need to grab him. Robert Woods is somebody that needs to be added in all leagues after over 100 yards and 2 touchdowns last week. He's almost a must-start. Not quite there yet, but he's almost. One or two more big weeks, and he will be. Cooper Kupp. Holy crap. Grab Cooper Kupp. We've been telling you for 3 weeks, and all he does is he puts up the same stat line every week. Usually 4 or 5 receptions, about 50, 60 yards, and he still leads the NFL in red zone targets. It's happening, people. Please.
Some advice for you guys. If Jared Goff and Cooper Kupp are available, pick them both up.
Yes, both of them. I don't care who you have to drop.
I really don't.
Okay,
yeah,
that's not true. But
I mean, if you're going to be dropping potentially, like if you have, hopefully you don't by now, but if you have Jamal Charles magically still stashed on your bench, drop Jamal Charles. There's no point in keeping Jamal Charles anymore. on your bench that's just basically just whittling away and collecting dust. So drop a guy like a Jamal Charles, pick up a guy like a Cooper Kupp, and if you happen to have if you happen to have a scenario, and this is just kind of me talking, and you can talk about it, CJ, but if you have potentially two quarterbacks, and one of your quarterbacks is a backup, and it's not potentially panning out for you, then I would highly suggest picking up Jared Goff.
Yeah, absolutely. Jared Goff needs, like we were saying before, needs to be added in all leagues and probably started in all leagues, unless you have Tom Brady, Carson Wentz, maybe Cam Newton now, and Matt Stafford. Those are the guys that I'm not really replacing with Jared Goff. But that's it. That's a short list. So,
so now this kind of takes me to the question, because you in one of the fantasy leagues, who my two quarterbacks are. So obviously I have no choice this coming week, because I believe Cam Newton's on a bye. So who do I turn to? I turn to Carson Wentz. But in general, if I have those two quarterbacks, is it just a rotate scenario between Carson Wentz and Cam Newton? Or should I be playing Carson Wentz more, or should I be playing Cam Newton more?
If it's a one-quarterback league, I think that's the situation where you're probably trying to deal Cam Newton this week, unless it's a dynasty league. But if you have two quarterbacks now, and both of these guys are going to be off of buys, they don't have buys the rest of the year, then I'm confident in both of those guys every single week. Carson Wentz is pretty much matchup-proof at this point, and Cam Newton always has been because of his legs. So I think that, sell high on Cam coming off the 4 touchdowns, and if you have two quarterbacks, get yourself a stud wide receiver, stud running back, because you always need those. And, or if you can get like a Rob Gronkowski or Zach Ertz for him, just an elite player, then that's something I do. But if you're hell-bent on keeping both of them, then I think that you got to look at whoever has the best matchup every week and you're starting them. I don't think that there's a surefire answer there.
All right. Anything else that you would like to add, or if Brooks is listening in, if he wants to add how much I suck again, or if he has a fantasy question as far as that, we'll see if he chimes in. But is there anything else that you would like to add?
Just two people. Danny Woodhead may or may not be coming off of injured reserve this week. Add him this week if you haven't already, and stash him, because he's going to be like Christian McCaffrey when he comes back, catch a lot of passes. And Corey Davis, it's just, he was the first wide receiver picked. I think that you're going to start seeing him produce here soon, as soon as he gets on the same page as Marcus Mariota. So look at both of those guys this week also.
All right, so let's take a little bit of a backseat now on the fantasy football front. And if you want to continue to chime at CJ, be sure to fire away on his Twitter handle at CJ?
At Cal Krainock 21.
At Cal Krainock 21. So we're going to take a little bit of a backseat on the fantasy football front. The general manager meetings, or the GM meetings as it's called, is like the appetizer to the winter meetings. And the winter meetings usually take place, I believe it's around like the end of November and into December, if I'm not mistaken. And really, the winter meetings, for those of you that don't know what the winter meetings are, it's kind of it's probably one of the best off seasons that compares really favorably to the NFL free agency. There's a lot of high volume players that either change teams or re-sign, and so you look at the winter meetings. I've been proven to show my bias towards baseball a little bit more than football. So I tend to like the winter meetings a little bit more because usually the NFL free agency, as far as once it opens, you're going to get really the huge volume signings really on that day. But as far as the winter meetings, it stretches as far as a whole week or a whole 2 weeks, rather, once they enter the winter meetings. But we're talking about the Colorado Rockies more importantly as far as that, and we're going to talk about potentially who they should re-sign, who they should add potentially to their roster. I want to start with this because of the fact that as far as their staff and the young staff and the mid-season acquisition as far as catcher, catcher has been one of the more unstable offensive additions or just in general for the Colorado Rockies. You look at Tom Murphy, who in my estimation is more of a William Rosario, Chris Iannetta type, who's just going to knock the ball out of the yard, which is all fun and good.
Of that in Colorado already.
Right, where we have plenty of that. And, he could be the future at catcher, but so was Tony Walters. So Tony Walters is probably more of your how to handle a pitching staff type catcher versus the hitting side, which is something that he does need to work on. Well, they went out and they acquired Jonathan Lucroy, which, if you guys have been living under a rock, Jonathan Lucroy was one of the best catchers as far as WAR and just as far as one of the top 3 catchers in Major League Baseball. And so the Rockies ended up acquiring him, and it seemed like he really, once he was acquired, he really started to handle the pitching staff incredibly well. John Gray, he was responding well to. Herman Marquez especially was really coming on strong from really the midway points of the year to finishing on very, very strong. And same with Tyler Anderson, who is CJ's favorite Colorado Rockies pitcher. But
I'm just, I feel like not even qualified to talk about the Rockies because I despise their management so much.
But so far though, we can start with that one. In your estimation, should the Rockies make Jonathan Lucroy their main in-house free agent key?
I don't know if it should be their main one. We can all say what we would do if we were running the front office, but I was going to say,
is it Greg Holland or Jonathan Lucroy?
I think that Lucroy proved himself as at least a middle-of-the-pack catcher defensively, and offensively he played well. And I think that's more valuable than Greg Holland. And I think that's because you can find I think the relief pitchers you can find cheaper than you can a catcher that's maybe not elite, but is going to be good for your club. There's not a lot of those, and I think that he's probably more important than that. You look at the Rockies got Greg Holland last year for super cheap, and he played well. You can do that with relief pitchers. If you want to be elite in the bullpen, you need to throw some money around.
There was also incentives, though.
But
I was going to say there was incentives though with that if he reached a certain number of playing time or a number of saves, that it would kick up to $15 million. So while it was a 1 year, I believe it was a 1 year $12 million deal, it would bump up to, it was a 1 year $9 million deal, if I'm not mistaken, that would bump up into a mutual option or I think it was a mutual option, and it ended up getting bumped up to $15 million because of incentives. However, it appears that he's going to get a lot much more than that.
Right, and that's where you start to get a little dicey when you start talking about the Rockies is when you talk about spending money. Because generally in the past, the only time that they've spent money is on bats. And, we saw Ian Desmond as the big signing last year, and that didn't make a whole lot of sense at the time, but that's where they threw their money. And so I worry that, the bullpen was an Achilles heel for the Rockies, which I think is going to be the case almost no matter who's in your bullpen, unless you have like a Chapman or somebody like that when you're playing at Coors Field. Because I think that it's just hard to pitch. It's hard to pitch in Colorado, and whether that's physically because of the elevation or because mentally we've persuaded everybody that it is, I don't know. But whatever reason, we haven't seen really good success out of Colorado pitchers, even when we've had good talent, minus a couple good seasons from Ubaldo. And
I was gonna say, here's the thing that I have the problem as far as letting Greg Holland hit free agency, and it's really a gray area for the Rockies because Greg Holland halfway through the year was one of the best, if not the best, closer in baseball. His splitter, or should I say his slider/splitter, was dirty. There was just no one, as far as one of the best pitches in baseball, there was no one in Major League Baseball that could hit him. And so as far as where potentially the Rockies should go, I would still look at Greg Holland just from the standpoint the Rockies, and as far as one of the big miscues over their period of a program and as a franchise has been the inability to win one-run games. And winning or achieving 40-plus saves is a very rare achievement. I mean, obviously, Eric Gagne put up ridiculous amount of saves when he was with the Dodgers that one year. But it's incredibly rare to put up 40-plus saves, and especially win the one-run games that Greg Holland was able to accomplish midway through the year. Because he was able to do that, it put the Rockies, at least in somewhat comfortable fashion, to make it into the postseason. And so for that, in my estimation, should Ryan Zimmerman have been Comeback Player of the Year? Not really. I mean, Greg Holland should have been, but it was really just because of how he flailed near the end. But Greg Holland was incredibly valuable as far as winning those one-run games. And really, at the end of the day, I think he was just gassed. You know, you think back to the Tommy John surgery that he had. It was an 18-month recovery. It was the first time that he really was pitching for a professional team since his days with the Royals. And so I think that overall for Greg Holland, it goes back to comfortability potentially, and as always, money talks. And so I think kind of the under the radar point with Greg Holland is he has always pitched with Steve Foster. And that could potentially play into the fact that either do I want to take a lesser deal with more years, or should I get my money elsewhere and potentially more years elsewhere for a team like the Chicago Cubs or the St. Louis Cardinals? You know, so that it's kind of that gray area really for the Rockies and also Greg Holland, knowing the fact that he will, if he goes somewhere else, he will pitch for someone not named Steve Foster.
Yeah, I think that comfortability is something that you mentioned is really key here, I think. And I hope, for the Rockies' sake, that Greg Holland takes this into account. Because, I mean, he pitched well in Colorado, and he proved that you can. And not a lot of people have done that. And I think the Rockies are in a position to make them kind of, add him, but they also showed that they know that they need to add more pieces with some of their midseason trades this year. They show that they're willing to do what it takes to put people around him in the bullpen that can help him succeed. And maybe that didn't end up happening this year as great as they wanted it to, but they showed at least that they were willing to. And as long as they can, I think it's a mistake for a team to call Greg Holland, even with the season that he had, and make them their guy, their go-to every single night that they're in the ninth inning close game. Do I think he can be a closer? Yes, but I think that there's those guys like Chapman, Miller, people like that you can always go to in a tight situation. I don't know if Holland is that, but he's pretty close. And you put some good pieces around him, and you're going to have something there, and you're going to be able to help out that young starting pitching staff, which is what, if they're not going to spend money on a starter, then they need to do that, which you've seen a lot of teams doing, like the Indians, although they had a more elite starting pitching staff. The Yankees have done this, where they really build up the back end of that bullpen, and then they just take a decent pitching staff in, get a lead, and turn it over to the pen. If the Rockies can do that, they've got the offense to win a lot of games. But I don't think the thing with Greg Holland is it comes down to how much money you got to pay him. The Rockies don't like to spend a lot, He might not be, an elite closer. He might demand that much money, though, and are you going to pay that? The Rockies probably don't. That I hope they do, but they probably don't. When you have people like Jonathan Lucroy there, you're going to bring in the inevitable bat in free agency that they do every year, and they're going to put money there, and it doesn't give me a lot of hope.
Let me ask you this, and I think that while on the surface, last offseason, they sealed up their first base on the surface with Ian Desmond at first base. However, I really hadn't thought about this until a few days ago. What Ian Desmond brings is potentially a guy that you may have paid 5 years, $70 million to. But really, he also provides incredible flexibility to where he can play anywhere. If you want to make him a starter in the outfield, which you should, or you can make him a starter first base, which you should. There's two different ways that you can go. Obviously, you want to know what you have in David Dahl. I understand that. But he provides so much versatility. And where I'm going with this is that there's a first baseman out there. And as far as comfortability, we talk about that. There is a camaraderie potentially as far as familiarity, as far as players, and that would be Eric Hosmer and Greg Holland. Obviously, both are free agents right now. However, let's just say, for the sake of argument, that magically that Jonathan Lucroy comes back, and magically Greg Holland comes back. If you're Greg Holland, and you're pitching the idea that the Rockies had a winning team this year, but overall you have a franchise that is in a dire need of an athletic first baseman, why not go out and get a guy like a Jose Abreu? Trade one of maybe your Ryan McMahons or some of those young pieces that could potentially get you a guy like a Jose Abreu, or maybe not even trade anybody and get a guy like an Eric Hosmer.
Yeah, for me, I look at it, if they added somebody like that, that's going to put the offense over the top. I agree with you there. I think that's an addition that is like J.D. Martinez to the Diamondbacks this year, where it's going to push that offense to levels that nobody can really compete with. I think the Diamondbacks had probably the best offense in the MLB this year after the All-Star break. But like what we saw with the Diamondbacks is if you don't have that back-end pitching to back it up, then when you're playing at that high elevation place, just like the Diamondbacks were, which a lot of people don't talk about Arizona as being high elevation, but it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If you play at that high elevation place and you have your 3, 4, 5 starters just getting teed off on in this era of elevate and celebrate with the baseball, all these hitters trying to hit dingers, and you're at the high elevation place, yeah, that's you might not be able to hit people out of the park every night. And for me, I would feel more comfortable with the offense that you have now for the Rockies, trading for, it doesn't even have to be maybe an elite starter at first, but maybe you just get someone that throws a good sinker or a good runaway changeup from left-handers if he's a righty, that is going to keep people from lifting the ball in Colorado, because that's where the MLB is shifting. You've had Brooks on talking about that, about how
right.
launch angles are taking over the game and people are starting to elevate. Okay, so you need pitchers if you're at high altitude places that are going to keep the ball out of the air. That's impossible to lift. And there are pitchers like that. Those are the guys that throw the nasty change-ups that run away on you, that you have to try to go the other way. They're the splitters, which is the reason that Greg Holland was so good. Those are the kinds of guys that are good in Colorado. So if you can get a staff with some guys with some good pitches like that, with the offense that you already have, then I think that you can make at least a run into the playoffs.
Consistently.
What was that?
I was going to say consistently, because they made the playoffs this last offseason. But yeah, I agree with you as far as making the postseason consistently.
Right. Like, Colorado deserves to be in the playoffs for more than one game. They do. They're overdue. The fans are loyal. They, I haven't been to a Rockies game where I thought it was empty, ever, or at least in a really long time. Even when they're not that great, people are still coming, and we owe the fans something. You owe them a trip to the playoffs that's not a disappointment in the first wild card game. They deserve that, and everybody knows that it's the pitching. But do you really, Cameron, I mean, I can ask you what you think, but do you really think that they're going to go out and get a pitcher? I mean, they haven't showed us that they will.
Well, I think that this is going to be very interesting because, you're looking at an area where Jeff Bridich was obviously very active, unlike Dan O'Dowd, which was so phenomenal to see, that he went out and got pitching, and he got a bat, and he got it from a position that, at least from a hitting standpoint, was their most weakest position as far as offense. And he got a guy of Jonathan Lucroy. He came in and, he obviously kind of rekindled some of the stuff that he had back in the National League. So he started playing a little bit better once he came to the Rockies. Then you get to a Pat Neshek, and Pat Neshek was arguably the best bullpen arm in the entire National League, and he played with the worst team in baseball, the Philadelphia Phillies. And so I think that, the issue that I have with it is there is now so many holes potentially on this bullpen. Because I didn't realize that Jake McGee is a free agent. I didn't realize that Pat Neshek is a free agent. So Greg Holland, Pat Neshek, and Jake McGee are all free agents this year. So they will be updating and upgrading that bullpen no matter what. However, as evidenced, and this is kind of going to what you're talking about, as evidenced, and maybe I'm just more kind of thinking along the lines as far as a potential veteran guy or a potential ace, and whether that's going to be a German Marquez or whether that's going to be a John Gray, well, we don't know. You certainly hope and pray that it's going to be John Gray eventually. But I would almost, especially with what transpired in the wild card game, I would think long and hard, meaning the Rockies, and I would think long and hard about trying to go after a Jake Arrieta or a Chris Archer or potentially a Marcus Stroman. There was rumors percolating last season that the Rockies, and boy, are they geniuses for not doing this, but there was rumors out there that they could have offered Charlie Blackmon to the Toronto Blue Jays for Marcus Stroman, and it ended up not obviously not going down. But Marcus Stroman and Chris Archer and Jake Arrieta would be three potential pitchers, and obviously this is high-end scenario, but it gives you the stability now with a young rotation. Jake Arrieta is obviously potentially the veteran of that entire group, but you would have potentially a front end of the guy, whether that is a Jake Arrieta, a Chris Archer, or Marcus Stroman, that you could potentially go to in a one-game playoff or potentially a do-or-die situation that you could turn to. And so I think that that's kind of the interesting point for the Rockies, that they have to decide, do they go after not just a bullpen arm, but do they actually bite the bullet, trade some of their key prospects? Maybe do they cut ties with Trevor Story in order to make that happen and finally call up Brendan Rodgers, who's going to be a star? So do they actually bite the bullet and decide, let's go ahead and trade a guy like a Trevor Story, and maybe put in maybe one of their other key prospects and maybe see if they can get a guy like a Chris Archer or a Marcus Stroman.
Right, or trade a guy like Brendan Rodgers. I mean, yeah, we all think he's going to be a star, but you really don't know yet. And a lot of teams have shown that they're willing to trade those top prospects for, 1 year run at it. And I don't think it has to be a 1 year run for the Rockies, but that's a trade chip right there. He might even be worth more than Trevor Story to, a team like, I don't know, say the White Sox or somebody rebuilding. They have a good pitcher to give up, like Jose Quintana. When he got traded from the White Sox, you could see a move like that go down, but the Rockies haven't shown that they'll do that in the past. And so I hope that they learn from their mistakes and they do it. And, like somebody like Jake Arrieta is so interesting to me because you have a really young pitching staff. You have an experienced veteran in Jake Arrieta who is known for having success because of the downward movement on his pitches, which is going to play in Coors Field, which is what you need. And, he seems like a logical fit if they're willing to pay the money for him to be there. But, I don't know. They've never opened their pockets that big before. So
well, they have. It's just backfired.
Yeah, that is true. It has backfired. And so, I feel like that would be a smart decision would be to go with that. But, I think that as fans, we all just hope and pray that they're going to make the move that's going to put us over the top. And, a lot of people know my difficulties with Rockies management and the way I feel. I have no faith that they're going to do it. But I hope that they prove me wrong.
Absolutely. All right, CJ, I'm going to let you go. Thank you very much, man, for obviously the fantasy insight and kind of talking some baseball. It is the GM meetings, and we'll obviously be talking more as far as the baseball is concerned between all of us. There's going to be all sorts of stories from here on out. But as always, check out CJ Krainock over at fantasygurus.com for all your fantasy football needs currently right now. And once that time comes, there will be a bunch of other fantasy sports involved there as well. CJ, man, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Cameron.
That was CJ Krainock, and as always, thank you to him for spending so much time with me. As always, he is kind of a multi-talented as far as a fantasy guru, and to do a little pun intended there, and as well as his baseball knowledge. He really is an epitome of an analytical guy when it comes to professional baseball. He may not have the most popular opinion, he may not have the best opinion, but it is an opinion that frankly does carry some decent weight because he has some analytics to it. So I really do respect his opinion. You can go back and listen to all of their podcasts together as far as the baseball dialogue, or it's more importantly the fantasy football dialogue podcast over at iTunes and over at iHeartRadio. So we'll see as far as what potentially could happen with the Colorado Rockies, but more importantly, with your fantasy football lineup. So thank you guys very much for tuning into the Cameron Parker Show. When we come back, we're going to take a little bit of a quick break because we've already spent about an hour talking about the fantasy football year and obviously about the Colorado Rockies. We are going to take a quick 3-minute break, and when we come back, we are going to talk about the Denver Broncos and the disappointment that has been this Denver Broncos season.
Let the heavens roar and all that's within me. Can't stop singing now. Revival is coming. There's no other name. To you be the glory. Every victory you have delivered me. Don't ever stop. Come on, let's sing it now. Let everlasting love. Oh, it surrounds me. Vindicating grace. My God, you're amazing. Don't ever stop. Come on, let's sing it now. Sweep me off my feet. I will dance for you. With all my heart, I will bless your name. Give it all to you. You're all I need. From the grip of pain, you have rescued me. Sweep me off my feet. I will dance for you.
Welcome in, ladies and gentlemen. We are doing a little bit of a at-length discussion talking about the Cameron Parker Show in general. So thank you guys very much for tuning in. This is a Cameron Parker Show discussional show, as now has been in the past. It was our first break, certainly, as far as that. So be sure to like the Cameron Parker Show. Follow the show handle. It is at CP_show. And follow CJ at Cal Krainock 21. He is our fantasy football insider. Thank you very much to CJ for stopping by and talking some fantasy football with us. So obviously we're going to be talking now about the Denver Broncos, and the Denver Broncos have encountered a little bit of a frustrating and, well, disappointing season, to put it, mildly. But the Denver Broncos certainly are playing not up to their potential, and so I believe that for the Broncos, they have to start determining when is now, talking about the future. When can they build up and start playing to the future? And we will dive into that, because I really feel that if you look at the Denver Broncos, they are, as we've spoke at length, they are a very talented football team to be 3-6 currently right now. You have a very disappointing matchup against the Cincinnati Bengals next weekend, but you look over at the next 5 games against, bad opponents. Because of the play of the Denver Broncos, you have no idea what record or how they could potentially play against all of these opponents. Talent-wise, they match up, if not better, than any of them. But because of all that has gone on, everything is starting to add up that maybe they aren't as talented. Is it a personnel issue? Is it a coaching issue? All of these question marks start rolling in as far as potentially for the Denver Broncos. Who are the Denver Broncos? What is their identity? And once they start losing this game against Cincinnati, if potentially they lose this game to Cincinnati, you have to understand, okay, let's scrap everything that we've done so far this season and start playing the potential first-round pick or these players so that we can understand potentially what the future holds. And so I think that as far as this, Brock Osweiler certainly didn't play all that bad against the New England Patriots, but overall, it still was not good enough. And when it's not good enough, you're still going to lose to 41-16. And while they were able to move the ball effectively, they were not able to put points up in the end zone. And when you think about it, as far as the points in the end zone, really, and it isn't just against the New England Patriots. Certainly the Patriots are better than anybody in this regard. But the Patriots, when playing the Patriots, you have to put up touchdowns in the red zone. You cannot be contagious in how unsuccessful you have been in the red zone. You have to put up touchdowns against the New England Patriots. You also cannot turn the ball over. That goes to any football team in the National Football League. You cannot turn the ball over numerous times and continue to try and see if you're going to get away with it. I've been praising Isaiah McKenzie for his potential skill set, what he could give the Denver Broncos. But right now, you have to do what's best for this football team. You have to sit Isaiah McKenzie. It is the best thing for your football team. This has nothing to do with the future of Isaiah McKenzie. I still believe that the future is incredibly bright for Isaiah McKenzie. But right now, he is hurting this football team by being out there on the football field. And the best thing for Isaiah McKenzie is to, work on his technique, most importantly, and two, be out and right now be off the football field. And that may sound harsh, and it may sound to a point, but at the same time, Isaiah McKenzie is best served on the bench. Now, as far as the quarterback situation, well, for starters, it was great to see a quarterback get the ball out of his hand a lot quicker. But at the same time, you can get the ball out quicker, but it certainly plays into the point of, what is the decision? He was getting the ball out quicker, and he was certainly exposing the weaknesses of a Malcolm Butler. Putting it into the places where only Emmanuel Sanders can get it. And certainly it helped having a very healthy Emmanuel Sanders out there on the football field. But the fact of the matter is you can't throw it to an Emmanuel Sanders every single time. As potentially convenient as that might have been as far as wanting to throw it to Emmanuel Sanders every single play, you can't do that. So for the Denver Broncos, they have to find the best alternative, and that's starting to get to a second guy. You have a guy in a Demaryius Thomas that you can go to that can move the football down the football field, but you have to do it on a consistent basis and continue to go through your progressions. But the fact of the matter is, right now, Brock Osweiler is who we think he is, and he is a guy that is going to, much like a Trevor Siemian, he's going to move the ball in between the 20s. He's going to have some very porous throws. He's going to have some interceptions, but he is not going to convert in the red zone. He's not going to convert into points. And converting in the red zone is what separates the bad quarterbacks to the good quarterbacks, and from the good quarterbacks to the great quarterbacks. You must be efficient in the red zone, and if you are, you're going to win a lot of football games as far as how efficient you can be in the red zone, and the Broncos are not doing that. They are able to move the ball somewhat effectively, but as far as these past few weeks, they have not been able to move the ball at all. They've been getting a lot of 3 and outs. They're putting so much pressure on the defensive front that really they're just so gassed. And I think that, as far as amount of blame, there does need to be some blame being thrown around to that defense. One of the biggest weaknesses as far as the Broncos defense in its history have been its inability to protect the tight end or to guard the tight end, and especially the running backs. And this is why the New England Patriots over the years have been such a difficult opponent, and that is because of the ability to move the ball with the running back and the tight end. Rex Burkhead is an absolute dynamic playmaker. He is Danny Woodhead on steroids. He can run the ball in between the tackles. He's very underrated at that. And he has certainly shown the capability to be a passing threat out of the backfield. And he's going to make a lot of linebackers miss just because of how shifty he is. He's an incredible, savvy wide receiving back, but he's also savvy enough that he can run it inside, and especially with the Denver Broncos defensive line, it's really underperformed really in the last few weeks. However, it's been pretty steady. It's been certainly one of your rocks, probably, and overall, potentially, should you look at the scenario of getting rid of some of your pieces to make the rest of your team better, I think you have to consider all options once you get to that offseason, as far as getting rid of maybe an Aqib Talib, despite what could potentially sever a locker room, and maybe getting something good for an Aqib Talib, whether that is a new offensive lineman or whether that is a third wide receiver, but just something on offense that you can work with, that you can certainly upgrade your team from that. It would be very beneficial at that, and especially from the standpoint that, the future is now, and you have to see what the future holds for Bradley Roby. Bradley Roby could potentially be a better cornerback than Aqib Talib. I've been on record as saying that in the tweets and everything that I've been putting out on social media. And that goes back to last year, or really even 2 years from that matter. But really, the Broncos have to figure out what their identity is. They cannot just sit back and just coast their way and just coast their way thinking they are going to win many football games, because at this rate they are not. And so once they potentially, if they do, lose this football game, they have to start thinking to themselves, this translates now to our quarterback discussion, should they start playing their first-round draft pick? Look, the mental side, I've been on record, the physical is certainly a bad news as far as Paxton Lynch is concerned. But the fact of the matter is that Paxton Lynch is now tied to John Elway. He's tied to him being a first-round draft pick. If he is not able to perform, that falls on John Elway himself. And especially with the everything that's transpired with John Elway, there is some potential blame that does need to be thrown around to John Elway. He's certainly hit a lot of home runs as far as his defensive draft picks, but you go into the offensive side of the ball, and it really starts with Cody Latimer. Cody Latimer has to play much better than he has. He's certainly gotten better, it seems, as the year has progressed, and especially with familiarity to Brock Osweiler. But really, the Broncos, and especially John Elway, have to be better when it comes to drafting on the offensive side of the ball. And we take it to the Cody Latimer year. The Cody Latimer year was the best offensive draft class for a wide receiver, where they missed out on Allen Robinson and Jarvis Landry, and you were hearing rumors that the Broncos one of the Broncos coaches wanted Jarvis Landry over Cody Latimer. And boy, is that backfired. The fact of the matter is that the Broncos have not fared well when it comes to drafting and finding offensive talent, and especially at the quarterback position. You know, they take a long flyer in the 7th round for Trevor Siemian, and he outperforms your first-round draft pick. That bodes exceptionally horrible. That's exceptionally horribly on your first-round draft pick as far as everything that transpires. So maybe that's just shook Paxton up so mentally that he has no idea if he can still do it anymore. Who knows? Fact of the matter is, though, there's only still a 2.5 game sample size for Paxton Lynch that you have no idea what could potentially be of good or bad for Paxton Lynch. So you need to find out what is at your disposal with Paxton Lynch. Is he a guy that you can just maybe potentially have as your quarterback of the future, or is he the word that we all never want to say? Is he in fact a bust? Because that's really the only determination. He only has a 2.5 game sample size. You can't label a guy a bust with only a 2.5 game sample size. Is the mental and physical certainly part of it? Well, yes. And really now is this underlying question as far as what is this coaching staff going to be consisted of? Is it going to be this instance that where they just are in over their head? Look, Paxton Lynch has been removed off the injury report for the past few weeks now. But yet we are hearing from the head coach and especially from the staff that the Denver Broncos still are babying and putting the training wheels on Paxton Lynch because he's just not ready yet. He's throwing from, I believe it was 10 to 20 yards, but he has yet to throw the deep pass. So they are putting training wheels right now on Paxton Lynch. Look, if he's not on the injury report and he's not in fact injured, then why is he being so limited? If he's being limited and he's not on the injury report, you may as well put him on the injury report and continue to limit him during this time. You may as well do that. But it's too late right now. You know, you have Brock Osweiler potentially in his second last stand against the Cincinnati Bengals, and if he loses against the Cincinnati Bengals, then you are looking at this scenario where Brock will be benched and Paxton will be starting. I don't foresee a scenario that they turn to Trevor Siemian if they win the game. Everything is just so bad right now with the team. They have to figure out everything that's going to transpire with this team. You know, there is a serious identity crisis, and from the coaching staff and from all the decisions that are being made, there is a lot of there is a semblance of blame that does need to be put on the coaching staff. When you keep, I've said it before on the Cam Parker Show, insanity is doing the same thing over and over and over and expecting a different result. If you put Isaiah McKenzie continuously on the special teams unit for a punt return, that falls on coaching because you continued to put him back out there. You continued to put him back out there. And that is a bad look on a first-year head coach. And whether Vance Joseph is in over his head or not, he still has to make the best potential decisions for a football team. And right now, it is not cutting it. It is not cutting it. He is he's not finding any sort of rhythm with an offense. He's not finding any sort of rhythm on the tight ends. And then you look at Joe Woods, the once heralded defense seems to have lost a little bit of a step with the secondary. It seems like they can't cover nearly as well as they once did. And then you go into the defensive line. I don't know what happened exactly with that. They were once successful for the first 6-7 weeks, and all of a sudden everything went kerplooey. And all of a sudden they aren't the best defensive line unit in the entire National Football League. So I don't know whether that's a scheme issue, whether that's a coaching issue, but it certainly doesn't bode well when you look at it from the standpoint that the Broncos, and especially the coaching staff, it's a horrible situation for both the coaching staff and the players involved. They're just not a good football team right now. The Denver Broncos, when all intents and purposes, are not a good football team. And can they continue to right that ship around? Who knows? But the Denver Broncos are now facing, and this is the other part of the scenario, they're now facing the scenario of potentially getting a top 5 draft pick. And this is another reason that leads to Paxton Lynch. You have to see what you have in him, because if not, you need to turn your sights to a Alex Smith, to a Kirk Cousins, to a Drew Brees, or to a top draft pick. And I will tell you guys this, is that I am full on expecting the Denver Broncos to put on a full court press for either Drew Brees or Kirk Cousins. Alex Smith is the wild card, potentially, for the Denver Broncos, but Drew Brees and Kirk Cousins, I am full on expecting, in no particular order, I would probably say maybe Kirk Cousins, but I would full on expect the Broncos to show at least a good, solid interest in trying to sign Kirk Cousins or Drew Brees. And if they don't do that, and this is regardless of a top 5 pick, I think regardless, if you can get a guy like that, especially Kirk Cousins, Drew Brees is 39 years old. If you get him, you're basically going back to the Peyton Manning experiment, which isn't all that of a bad idea. I mean, you obviously had so much success with Peyton Manning when he was here. It would also perk up the idea potentially for the defense that says, hey, we have another guy that we can have as quarterback that we can potentially still have that Super Bowl window. And then you got a guy like Kirk Cousins. The thing with Kirk Cousins that makes it so interesting is because of the fact that he is a tremendous quarterback. He has leadership. He has that swagger that you can have potentially with your offensive line unit that is starting to come together. For as much crap as the offensive line is getting, they played a little bit better the last few weeks. They're getting a little bit of some cohesiveness, and they're starting to play a little bit better. They didn't allow a sack to the New England Patriots last week, so they're starting to get a little bit better. And so you start to look at, well, okay, the quarterback situation appears to be one of the biggest issues on this football team, so they have to address it, and they have to maybe look at potentially getting a guy like Kirk Cousins. If they can get a guy like a Kirk Cousins, it's going to it's going to put them in a great situation to secure their future now and then until once they decide to either re-sign Kirk Cousins or go with someone else. But the fact is, their future will have been secure with a guy like Kirk Cousins. But there's a lot of issues with that because of the fact that you look at the Broncos overall. Does John Elway, and maybe this goes to a little bit of his ego, but does John Elway find himself comfortable enough to outbid a potential quarterback desperate team, for instance, the Jacksonville Jaguars? Therein lies the problem of wanting to overspend for a quarterback like Kirk Cousins and Alex Smith, all those guys that are potentially out there, because it is a better quarterback free agent. It is a better free agent class that's out there for quarterbacks than has been in recent memory. And so you have to make that decision. That is, is the free agent draft class better or is the NFL quarterback draft class better? You have to make that assumption, and you have to make that quick, because if you do, then you're going to have a really good top 5 pick potentially, but you're also going to have potentially your quarterback figured out in the offseason, and then you can go with best player available in the top 5. If you do that, then you could potentially have secured your football future in the long run. So I want to thank you guys for tuning in to the Krainock Parker Show. This has been another long one, about nearly an hour and a half broadcast. So thank you guys for tuning in. Be sure to follow the show handle at CP_show. Follow my Twitter handle at Cameron Parker PO. And as always, follow the fantasy guru at Cal Krainock 21. This has been another edition of the Krainock Parker Show, and want to remind everybody to tune in on Friday, as we will try and see if I can get my good friend and buddy, Sayer Bettinger, the one that supplies the music in my breaks that I will play every once in a while. And oh, by the way, I want to wish him an early happy birthday. His birthday is tomorrow, so happy early birthday to Sayer Bettinger. You guys have a blessed rest of your evening, and I will be back on Friday at 7 o'clock.